It's time today for another one of my FM24 step-by-step guides, and this week we're going to talk about dynamics. We've covered youth development, we've covered mentoring, and we've got a few other topics to come. But this is one that is often the source of many complaints about Football Manager. This year in particular, if you look across the forums, if you look across Discord chats, Twitch chats, YouTube comments, all sorts, you find plenty of complaints about things relating to dynamics. Now, that might not be directly, that might be individual player complaints, that might be things that are subconsciously and not really in your thought process affecting the dynamics, but they're affecting the dressing room atmosphere, they're affecting team cohesion and managerial support, and therefore making your job harder in FM24. So today, we're going to break down the three key areas of dynamics: team cohesion, dressing room atmosphere, and managerial support. And of course, while we all know that winning games is the easiest way to fix all of those, we're going to talk about a number of little things we can tweak and a number of little ways we can micromanage to make sure that we don't have as many issues here as we could have otherwise. So rather than managing dynamics, you could argue this is more preventing issues, but we'll see how it pans out. If you're looking forward to it, then please do put a thumbs up on the video. Let me know at the end if you've picked up any tips from this one or if there are any bits of this you aren't using already. A lot of it is common sense, a lot of it is simple, but for those of you that may not have played FM in recent years when the game has expanded, particularly on the communication side, or for those of you who are getting into the series now, this might be helpful when it comes to managing players and managing the dynamic screen. So we're going to flit in and out of FM here as I show examples of the things I'm talking about, but for now, let's move straight into the first area, which is team cohesion, because we all know the dynamic screen is split into three key areas, and team cohesion is the first of them. And it's the one that you often see the most complaints about in the early stages of a career, because generally when you go to a team, the cohesion's not often that great. Now, particularly in lower leagues, in non-league, and in that level of management that a lot of us like to take on for a challenge, it can be very difficult because you've got high turnovers of players, you've got a lot of change in social groups, you've got part-time training in some clubs, and of course you're quite limited in which tactical styles you can use. But today, we're going to cover key areas where you can help improve these things. But of course, in some areas, it is also a balancing act with other areas of the game, because if you do too much of one thing, something else might suffer. So let's talk about four key areas in team cohesion, and to do so, we're going to go over to FM24. So here we go then, and to make it as clear and obvious as possible later on, I've joined Manchester City so we get some glaring bits of information. But team cohesion overall is very simply how well your players are blended together, and that will have a huge impact on the mental state, the positioning, the following of tactical instructions, and the way that your players play on a match day. Have you ever wondered early on in a save why you've set up a tactic and it's being completely ignored? Well, if you've got a big red bar here, you've probably got the reason. Now, we're at a Manchester City side, and any top side really, you're not seeing a huge turnover of players every year. So largely this team cohesion, even at the start, will be nearer average than poor. If you're managing a non-league side, a lower league side where there's not a lot of training, there's not a lot of players that have been at the clubs many years, then you're going to see a very big red bar here in comparison. But let's talk about four areas where we can improve team cohesion ourselves. So the first of these is training sessions. Now, I think you would find this is the most obvious one, gets a lot of chat in Discord and on forums in particular. The simplest way to improve team cohesion is to dedicate time to team bonding in training, because if you go through to your training calendar, you'll see normally in pre-season, it will be automatically set up with a team bonding session no matter where you are. And if you dedicate it to your assistant manager to do training, you'll often find the same. But I would recommend overriding just in these instances, particularly when you're at those lower levels. You've got 15 new faces coming in, everyone out of contract, loads of new players, trying to settle on a new tactic as well. Then you might want to get team bonding in here. So, for example, you can see we've got a week there where we've got two friendlies. There is no team bonding session in, but of course it's pre-season as well. So a lot of the work you've got here is physical, and you don't want to take too much of that away because you want to get your players up to full fitness. So we might just sacrifice one session here and say, well, actually, I want the set piece routines because I'm still improving them. But I will give up an overall session and go to extracurricular, and you can do team bonding up to one session a week, but you can also add in a community outreach, which will do the same. And you can even see here when you set it up, the impact, team cohesion slightly increased. For team bonding, it's increased a bit more. But if you're desperate, both of those can have an impact. Now, you've got to be wary if you're a semi-pro or amateur side, you're not going to be training a lot. So you're not going to have the luxury of all these sessions City have got. You're going to have to make sure that it is the right thing for you. If you're desperate to make set pieces work, maybe that's more beneficial to you. If you've only got 2 sessions a week in pre-season, maybe you have to focus on the physical side. But I would recommend, certainly in those first couple of months, July and August, get yourself in with a team bonding session a week because it will make the world of difference. If we go back to the dynamic screen though, the second element that can improve team cohesion are actually social groups, which are something we've covered before in the mentoring and the youth development guide, because they are an important part of a player reaching the first team, and the impact extends beyond development and into team cohesion and the dynamics too, because if we go through to our social groups, it is a very simple thing. You will have noticed it from any workplace you've ever been in, any school football team, any Sunday league football team, whatever age you are, whatever teams you're in. If your team gets on well and it's tight-knit with more people hanging out together, you're generally going to get a better cohesion. Because if there's someone you don't speak to a week because you hate their guts and then you play next to them on a Sunday, you're going to struggle a bit, aren't you? Because you haven't got that natural bond or communication. You can see at City, there's a lot of players joined together in a core social group. Lots of fairly similar ages, players that have been at the club for a long time, which we'll cover a bit later on as well. But that makes it much easier to manage the dressing room. And that's why the team cohesion isn't as poor as well. What you can see at City, though, is those new players that have come in this summer. Yes, there's a couple in the core social group already. But the likes of Gvardiol and Kovacic, they're in a separate one. They're a bit of an outlier at the moment at the club. So getting those into one of the core social groups where they're regularly hanging out with people who are already established and in that core group can make a real difference. Now, I've talked about that before. You can do it via mentoring groups. Sometimes it will happen via time. And of course, by building relationships on the pitch as well, playing players together, etc. But this is something that is often undervalued in FM and is another way of getting your team cohesion to improve. The third thing I've got to talk about is a way to prevent problems, and that is transfer impacts. Now, I know this isn't always something that's possible. Of course, if you look at a club like Manchester City, the budgets you've got, you'll be looking at 2 or 3 signings a summer. You're looking at improving the squad rather than completely evolving it. Now, this isn't a luxury you get in the lower leagues. Your hand is often forced into a minimum of 10 to 12 squad changes a summer, but it is still important that you try and keep that core of 4 or 5 leaders where you can just keep them in the club, because again, it does link to dynamics. If you've got those people who are at the top of the hierarchy because they've been there 3 or 4 years, then you are going to be able to naturally have more of an influence on new players coming in, particularly if they're a bit younger, particularly if they're new to a country, etc. But if you sign 15, 20 players, you have to accept that team cohesion is going to decrease, because you're not going to be able to put 20 strangers together or 20 people that have never played football together before and say, here, be a tight-knit team, follow my tactic perfectly. It doesn't happen. It takes time, it takes work, and particularly, again, if you're a part-time or an amateur side, you're not going to have that training time to improve it quickly. So I would say, where possible, reduce transfer impacts. If you've got that choice of, look, I could get a slight upgrade in my backup left back, but realistically, it doesn't make a huge difference to the club. It's about the same wage. My left back's been here a couple of years. He's happy to sit on the bench, and he's got a couple of pretty good roles in the hierarchy in the social groups. Just leave it, because that is the one that will make the difference. Rather than replacing those 5 stars, just saving that one little player at the club could make an impact in the longer term as well, and just help reduce your problems at the start of the next season. It does also filter into your tactical selection as well, because in addition to the changing of tactical style, I do always talk in a new season about bedding players in. Let's just set up a tactic with City here as an example. If you bed in 8 new players on the opening day of a season, you are not likely to get a cohesive performance. You see that teams often start slowly in the lower leagues because they've brought in a number of players and then they fly later on in the season. So what I always talk about in a new season of FM is, can I just integrate those players slowly? Because the players that were here before, they might be half a star worse, but they're familiar. And then if you've got a game won or lost, you can bring those players on the last half an hour and gradually integrate them into the team, 1 or 2 at a time, rather than just chucking all 8 in at once and hoping it works overnight. In addition to the players in the tactic, though, we have got to talk about tactical familiarity, because this familiarity bar up here, which obviously increases once you've got players in it, is a sign of how well your players are able to adapt to your tactic and how cohesive they're going to be on the football pitch. It directly relates to the dynamic screen. If your familiarity is low, it will have an effect on dynamics. And the main reason for it being low is if it's unfamiliar. So changing tactics every 3 or 4 games because you're not getting the results you want, before it can even become familiar and bed in for those players, is just going to lead to carnage off the pitch. It's something we actually see in real life quite a lot as managers desperately search for outcomes when they're struggling. You do find they change from what they know, and you do find they change from what has often worked for them. And that often leads to a quicker spiral, because you then have a situation where the manager, the players, the coaching staff are all unfamiliar with what you're trying to do. And then you get that famous punditry phrase that the club lacks an identity. It doesn't have a playing philosophy. And that's something that you could fall foul of if you try and make too many changes too quick. I've talked about that on the channel countless times before. Make your tactical changes small and few and far between. And if you are planning to do a big overhaul of your tactic, train it in the background for a couple of months first. Set it up as a second or third tactic. Keep playing your primary one until the familiarity rises with your secondary one, which it will over time in training. You can adapt to that as well by doing extra tactical work on a training schedule. The final part on that front, as we've talked about training a lot and we've also talked about transferring back to players, is also staffing. Now, I'm a big advocate of getting the best in class staff you possibly can at a football club. I always use it as an advantage at the lower leagues rather than spending on players, because it's the cheapest way to make the biggest difference to your football club. However, if you change too many at once, you can find yourself in trouble again, because you want coaches who are going to be familiar with the style that they're going to be coaching. It's also important when you're signing coaches to keep an eye out for what their preferences are. What are their set piece preferences? What are their coaching styles? What do they tend to do and not to do? What are their preferred formations? If you can get as much of that on board as possible with a good personality, you're often going to be more likely to have success, rather than if you just throw together, say, here, the 10 best coaches with the best attributes, or at non-league level, the 2 coaches with the best attributes. I know they can be important. There are other things you should consider as well. So all of those little things can have an impact on team cohesion, whether it's preventing issues or it's helping improve more quickly. They can all be useful ways to help your club if time and training schedules allow. Of course, much more difficult at a semi-pro club than it is at Manchester City. With the first area of dynamics out the way, let's move ahead to the middle one. And I think the one that probably most complaints come from: club atmosphere and the dressing room atmosphere. There are a number of ways we can prevent problems here. Of course, we all know the best way to get a great atmosphere in a club is to win games. If you're winning all the time, lots of players are going to be happy, particularly the 11 that are starting. However, there are things you can do to prevent problems even when your luck is out on the pitch. So let's head back over to Football Manager and talk about some of the things we can do to improve the club and dressing room atmosphere. So obviously in our introduction there, we talked about results being the most important bit, and it is. If you're winning games, it's generally in the green. If you're losing games, it's generally in the red. But there are things we can do to help, and most of it boils down, in a simple nutshell, to preventing avoidable unhappiness. We've seen in FM this year, and there's been a lot of complaints about it. Players complaining about squad depth, players complaining about improved contracts so quickly. It's all those little nagging things that cause inbox items and problems that you just don't want to have. So what strategies can you set up? What little reminders and schedules can you set up as a manager to help prevent those problems arising? You're never going to get rid of all of them. You're always going to have a problem. It's part of management in any walk of life. However, how do we make as few as possible? Well, I've set up a few little things myself that deal with particular issues that pop up quite frequently. And the first one we've briefly mentioned already is new contracts. Now, if you're doing well, you will quite often get players who are asking for improved contracts because they're coming into the team, they're playing games, they may be playing more games than their squad status suggests, and they're starting to perform well and they're on a lower wage than other players. Well, that is an issue and it does crop up fairly frequently, but I'd argue an even bigger one relating to contracts and transfers is player unhappiness when the transfer window comes around. How many years have we had it in FM where transfer windows are just chaos because you've got players unhappy that bids are rejected, players who want to go, players who are changed by interests, and of course the emergence of agents and intermediaries in this game has definitely made that a bit harder, as it has in real life for football clubs. But what can we do to help? Well, I've got a little idea for this, and it's something I've done for a few years now with good success. It's all about when you schedule the management of your contract. So have a think about it now. When do you look at your contracts and make offers to players? When do you do your little renewal? Because most of us will do it 1 or 2 times a year. We'll look at when we need to renew contracts to prevent people being able to discuss terms with clubs, getting into the final year if you're at the top level, depending on what step of the ladder you're managing. But I would always recommend looking 1 to 2 months before a transfer window. So generally, the 2 points of the year I look at my contracts are around the middle to end of November and the middle to end of March, because once you offer a new contract, generally in the first 6 months, a player won't want to move because they've signed a new deal, they're settled at a club, and they're happy with what's going on, unless you, of course, make them unhappy after. Now, there is a flip side to this. If you offer a new contract at that stage and it ends up going wrong, the player gets injured, or you're not happy with them, you get a better replacement in the window, you might have trouble offloading them. But what I do find is it prevents a huge amount of those little nagging issues in a dynamic screen, because player unhappiness, aside from results, is the biggest influencer of this bar under club atmosphere. And if you can get your contracts done with about 4 to 8 weeks before the transfer window starting, you'll generally have no problems with this in the window, because all those players that have signed new deals won't be worried about offers. They'll be settled at the club, they'll be happy with their new deal, and they'll be collecting a new loyalty bonus. They won't be worried about what's going on elsewhere. It also takes a lot of interest away from other clubs, because they know the player's just signed a new deal, and unless it's one of those deliberate ones with a release clause in, they know they're not going to be able to get the player as easy. So I do always recommend the importance of timing when it comes to offering your contracts. Of course, at clubs at the top level, you're only offering deals every 2 or 3 years to players. It doesn't make it quite so difficult. And of course, you've got the reputation and stature to hold on to most of them if you're a Manchester City, an Arsenal, a Real Madrid, a Barca, whoever. However, if you're at that bottom level and you're getting the snakes coming from the higher divisions, trying to steal your players for a pittance, getting those contracts in around November or March could save you an awful lot of time. The one other slight caveat with that, though, if you're in March and you're about to win a promotion or something, sort your deals out before, because the wage demands will go through the roof after you secure it officially. So managing contracts when it comes to players can be a great way of avoiding unhappiness. But what about managing playing time? Because one of the other complaints you see quite often down here and in your inbox is players complaining at their agreed playing time. It's actually a little stricter than it's ever been before this year, which perhaps is understandable in the modern game. But what you'll often find when you're at these football clubs, and you'll have noticed it yourself, particularly if you've been at a club for 2, 3, 4 years and had decent success, most of the squad support you, the managerial support's good, is that actually as you go through divisions or as you improve your squad, players will understand that they're not as strong as they were before. So if you were to go up a division and sign increased players, but you've got someone on a 3-year deal as an important player, they might understand that actually they're not going to start every game once you've improved the squad. So when you're in that situation, all you need to do is find your player, look at the squad and the agreed playing time. You can do it from this screen here and just reduce it by 1 level. Now, if you do it more than that, you're normally going to have a big problem. But what this does is it just mitigates concerns before they get to your door. So if you know at the start of the season now, let's say we're in our 3rd season, we've got the respect of the players. I know Calvin Phillips is only going to be a substitute this year. If everyone's fit, he'll get 30 games off the bench and maybe only 5 starts. What we want to do in this situation is prevent the problem of Calvin Phillips coming in November and saying, I'm a squad player, but I'm not getting many starts. What's going on here? Well, if we can prevent that problem in July or August, why wouldn't we? Now, at the moment, I've just joined Manchester City as a novice, so I doubt he's going to accept this. In fact, he is. So we can do this straight away. I've come in, I've looked at my squad and I've said, Calvin Phillips, you're not going to be a regular starter. You're not going to be a squad player. You're a sub at best. And now, because we've told him you're going to be an impact sub, that issue shouldn't come to our door as long as we give him no substitute appearances. That makes a huge difference and makes your life an awful lot easier to do that for 10 minutes with your squad, rather than to deal with all the issues and the messages and the problems that come up later in the season. The good news is, and I'll show you on a different example, if you go to a player who doesn't want to accept reducing their playing time, and I'm not sure this should be in the game, but it is at the minute, so it makes it easy for you. If you go to reduce terms on, say, Erling Haaland, you will get a big message from your assistant say, I wouldn't do that. He's going to be very unhappy. Now, you can talk to them if you want to take the honest approach, but you risk unhappiness there. But in those instances, you can maybe back out and think about, do I want to discuss a reduced terms contract? Do I want to look at selling them before it becomes a problem? Because I can't meet their expectations. So we've seen two examples there. One where the player's happy to reduce and we've prevented a problem, and one where it's not possible. But even then, the outcome makes us think, do we want to solve the problem a different way? And that can be via selling the player or offering them a new deal with less playing time. So those are probably my two top tips for ways to reduce problems and reduce unhappiness cropping up and those little concerns that players come to you with all of the time in FM24. But there are a couple of other things we can do, but this is kind of dictated by circumstance, so don't beat yourself up about it. You always get the warnings on the dynamic screen that players of similar age, similar nationality, similar personalities has a positive influence on dynamics and the club atmosphere. Now, you don't want to have too many people all of the exact same personality, because that has a negative implication elsewhere, unless they're all model citizens, of course. But what you want, and again, this links back to having a close-knit dynamics, having a good hierarchy, and having a tighter team and core social group, is you want players who are familiar with each other and who are comfortable with each other. And of course, the simplest way to do that is people who are at a similar stage of life, whether it's a similar age, grew up in a similar area, and have had a similar career. Of course, that's natural. But that's not to say you can't do it with others, as many top teams have proven. If you're at the lower levels of the game, you're probably naturally going to get that. You're going to get a lot of players of a similar age, and you're certainly going to get a lot that are of a similar nationality. What's crucial, though, is keeping a few of those at the club long term, so you've always got those leaders in a core social group. If you're at the top level, doing the other stuff will normally mitigate what you can't achieve there, because you don't want to ignore the best Brazilian wonder kid in the world with a great personality just because the rest of your team's English, do you? So those are a couple of my simple techniques to deal with club atmosphere. Of course, winning games will have a bigger influence than all of that. But if you can reduce the amount of times you get players coming to you with issues and unhappiness or concerns, then of course you've got less chance of the dressing room turning against you and less chance of losing managerial support, which is the third area of our dynamic screen. Now, we know that this area is hugely dictated by reputation. Where I go into Manchester City with a Sunday League reputation and no coaching badges, the managerial support will obviously be very poor. If I go in with an elite reputation and go in and manage in the Welsh Premier League or in the National League North and South, then players are going to sit up and take attention. If Pep Guardiola decides to take one of those jobs, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't need to do much to get the players to listen because he's got a reputation. For others, you have to earn it as you work your way up. So we're going to look at a few ways we can deal with managerial support. We can't have quite as much influence as we like here off the pitch. Ultimately, winning games is going to have a big impact here, and building our reputation is as well. But there are 2 or 3 little things we can do to help ease this process and maybe stop players turning against us in those early stages. So let's get back over to FM and see what I mean. So for the final area, we talk about managerial support. And the key element of that is keeping players on side. Now, we've seen in real life a couple of examples in recent weeks. We've seen at my club, Rob Edwards being the shining example of having players on side, getting the most out of them. And we've maybe seen what Troy Deeney's done at Forest Green last week, which, to be fair, is just a mistake he's apologised for. But where you just go and publicly rant about all your players because you're frustrated, which is not often going to get the dressing room on your side. So what we want to talk about here is little ways we can get the players on side and gradually influence them positively to get that reputation and manager support up. Because we can see the first element here, your reputation is quite low in relation to your players. I cannot immediately fix that as Manchester City manager. What I can do is positively influence a number of players. How do we do it? Well, team meetings is the first. There are certain points in the year where you have to have team meetings. We will be soon having one as a new manager at this club. And of course, if you're in one of those long, poor runs, or if you're doing really well, if you're in a big game deciding a title, you're going to have those little team meetings. And picking the right responses, getting positive responses are so, so important. That feedback is a real suggestion of how well your players support you. And if you can get positive reactions most times, you'll notice that creep up. So even if you've not seen it before, watch it when you do your new introduce yourself to the team meeting on the first day. Because once you've done that, if you get a positive response from everyone, The next day, this will creep up very, very slightly. That's the influence that getting your team on board can have. But in addition to doing that through team meetings, the best way we can do it is individual meetings. We've talked about it in relation to youth development before, praising training ratings of over 8, getting players on side by saying, yes, I like that and I want more of the same, and timing your criticism right as well. Don't over criticize players who are poor, but make sure you get it at the right time. If mid-season training levels suddenly drop below a 6 for a player, despite the fact that they should be fully fit and doing really well. If you've got an experienced player who's maybe had a really poor performance after showing a complacent attitude pre-match, those are those times where you can just remind a player, you need to do a little bit more. But for the majority of the time, this is about praise. Praising training level when it's really good. Getting those younger players who aren't as strong in a core social group to love you as they grow into the role. Because then when they become the team leaders a few years later, you're going to be their favourite personnel. You're not going to be able to do much wrong. But if we go and have a look at the squad and the individual chats, we also have other options as well. We want to praise players not just for training, but we can praise them if they've had excellent performances, but also for conduct. I always find if you've got really professional players, let's say you've got 10 who have just gone and joined in support of a player who's making a dressing room revolt. If you've got 2 or 3 other key players who haven't got involved, are still playing well, are still fighting hard, and are still doing their bit, then praise their conduct because it can have a real impact. Don't do it too often, but when you need it, it can be a real way to boost dressing room atmosphere, but also managerial support. Managing your players and man management is the thing that most people fail on in their jobs. I look at an example at my club, Luton, of Graham Jones, who is an exceptional coach. There's no doubt in that. He's coached many of the best players in the world, and he's still a Premier League coach now. But he came into management, and the way that he dealt with players and the media talking about his players ended up costing him his job, because he talked about not being able to win if certain players weren't available and that a lot of this squad wasn't ready for the level. And that doesn't fill you with confidence. It doesn't give your team belief. So the managing of interaction is so important. It's something I would encourage you to do more if you don't, because it's the easiest way to get your players on side and get them playing positively. When praising conduct and you've got good people in the dressing room, always bear in mind the hierarchy as well. Because ultimately when I come to this club, if I get these top 3 on side here, I'm going to get most of the dressing room on board as well. And that is really important when you're at a football club. So praising good conduct from your top players in the club hierarchy is a sure way to get the team on board. The other thing you can do doesn't actually affect your influence over players, but affects your reputation. And this is a luxury you won't always have. Again, we've been stuck in the Welsh Premier League and non-league football before, where your clubs are hemorrhaging money and you've got no chance of getting it. But as I saw this year at the start of the head coach in Japan, as we saw when we got a fairly fortunate takeover at Southend, we were able to see positive bank balances. And when that's the case, and when you've got good staff in, you can ask for a coaching badge from your club. Now, other than winning things and managing at a higher level, getting a coaching badge is the easiest way to increase your reputation. And if I want to get anywhere near the reputation of my players or my club at a team like this, I need to get them done quickly. So going and asking for coaching badges, you probably can't get away with it in your first couple of months at a club. But at any point after that, you should be all right. Time it right as well. If you're in a good run of form, if your club vision items and your board feedback is strong, if it's a B or an A, you're more likely to get accepted. If you're on a run of losing 4 or 5, they're probably not going to be as keen because they might be thinking about sacking you rather than investing in more coaching badges. So get your timing right for that. If you've got a big win, if you've got the board on side because of a certain event, go for the coaching badge then. Because as long as your board feedback is good and the club finances are okay, as in a positive balance, you should be able to get away with it and get on the ladder. And once you build up those coaching badges, not only will your attributes improve to help you provide better training and maybe provide better sessions and development to your players, but it will also increase your reputation, which helps massively with this managerial support. So those are my tips to help your level of managerial support, and overall that is my step-by-step guide to managing dynamics and trying to help yourself as much as possible. Ultimately, we all know when we're winning every game, things will take care of themselves on this screen, because quite often this isn't a screen you want to focus on, it's a byproduct of all of the little things in day-to-day management and of course of your results as well. But when you have got a list of issues piling up here and your club atmosphere is dipping and the results aren't going your way, that is when you're at risk of the sack, and that is when things are often going to be hard for you, and you'll find it more difficult to turn a corner. So trying to prevent those issues from occurring is a really important part of Football Manager, and it's a really important part of management in the real world as well. So hopefully, even if you use a lot of these, you did pick up one or two little tips today. If you did and you enjoyed this video, please do put a thumbs up on it. Let me know any of the bits you weren't doing before and any other tips you swear by when it comes to managing dynamics. There are a few other little things I could have covered as well, but I wanted to get the most important information in there too. And also, I would suggest if you're a fairly new player to FM, keep an eye on the dynamic screen because it does tell you a lot of the time what the impact of your decisions are going to be and what the impact of good or poor dynamics are, and it can be really helpful as a tutorial. But as always, thank you for joining me for another step-by-step guide. If you've missed the other two so far this year, they're up in the eye above, and we will have a few more over the next few months. But normal service will be resumed tomorrow as we return with our two long-term stories, The Head Coach and Saving Southend on Monday and Tuesday. We've gone through loads of seasons in both of those already, so if you're new along, you can find those up in the eye above. If you want to stay up to date with everything on the channel, subscribe and turn that notification bell on. And we'll be back here tomorrow afternoon to resume normal service in A Head Coach. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you there.